And we're excited that you're with us this evening. This is such an important talk, right? We are talking about issues of war and peace, the costs of war. And without further ado, I'm excited to introduce the renowned activist, author, and peacemaker, David Swanson. David is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, and he was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. David Swanson, thank you so much for your work, and thank you very much for joining us this evening.
I've lengthened the title of these prepared remarks to, here's the full title, Guided Missiles, Misguided Policies, and Changing Direction, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love World War III. If it's true that madness is more common in societies than in individuals, and if the society we live in is aggressively hastening, as I think is well established, climate collapse, I hear it's a little bit warm with most of you right now, ecosystem devastation, wealth inequality, and institutional corruption. In other words, processes that are clearly counter to conscious stated desires. Is this society perhaps no exception to the rule? Is it perhaps insane? And are there perhaps other interconnected madnesses that we don't see entirely clearly precisely because we are members of this society? What about locking huge numbers of people in cages at an expense much greater than giving them good lives? What about devoting land, energy, and resources to feeding animals to feed people using food that could have fed 10 times as many people without the environmental destruction and animal cruelty? What about employing armed and trained killers to tell people they are driving too fast or shouldn't bicycle on the sidewalk? Could it be that lots of stuff a saner culture would call loony looks as normal to us as burning witches, bleeding patients, and exhibiting eugenically awesome infants looked to others in the past? In particular, what if it's just not permanently and universally normal and rational to be taking all the steps being taken to hasten nuclear apocalypse? We've got scientists saying the catastrophe is more likely now than ever, and that the nature of it would be worse than ever previously understood. We've got historians saying the near misses are more numerous than ever before known. And yet, we've got media outlets informing everyone that the problem vanished 30 years ago. We've got a US government dumping vast treasure into building more nuclear weapons, refusing to forswear using them first, and talking about them as usable. One of the key reasons for the danger having supposedly passed is that the number of times the existing stockpiles of nukes could eliminate all life on Earth has been reduced, if you can dignify that with the term reason. Much of the world is clamoring for the elimination of nukes, while another chunk of the world is defending their manufacture, distribution, and routine threats of using them. Clearly, somebody is right and somebody is crazy. By somebody, I mean a whole society, not its individuals, and despite all the exceptions. What about the whole idea of killing people? Killing prisoners to teach them not to kill people, killing people who look from the perspective of a distant video camera like they might be an adult male in the wrong place and near a cell phone suspected of belonging to someone unliked, plus any men, women, and children who happen to be nearby. Killing people who cross a border and run from armed fighters. Killing people who get in the way of police and look like their skin has a bit too much pigment. What if the whole practice of killing all of these people has something wrong with it? What if it's as deranged as the doctors who bled George Washington to death, or Phil Collins' belief that he died at the Alamo, or Joe Biden's idea that the US government doesn't interfere in other nations' elections? What if killing people is certifiably bonkers, even in an imaginary scenario in which the United Nations has authorized a good humanitarian war, and the people being killed are all wearing uniforms, and nobody's tortured or raped or looted, and every murder is super respectful and free of hatred or animosity? What if the problem is the careful avoidance of peace that gets each war started, not the details of the atrocities? What if the phrase war crimes, as a phrase to say a lot in public so nobody thinks you're a fascist or a Republican, is actually as nonsensical as slavery crimes or mass rape crimes, because war is a crime in its entirety? What if every war for decades has actually killed disproportionately the so-called wrong people, the elderly, the very young, the civilian? What if there's nothing worse than war that can be used to justify war? The case made on the World Beyond War website is, of course, that the diversion of money into war preparations that make people less safe, not more safe, itself kills vastly more people than have been killed in all the wars thus far. It does this by depriving us of those things we could have spent the money on, things like food, water, medicine, shelter, clothing, etc. If this is true, and if it's additionally the case that war fuels hatred and bigotry and racism, that war and preparations for it devastate the natural earth, that war is the one and only excuse for government secrecy, that the war bases and weapons sales and free training and funding prop up horribly oppressive governments, that the war business erodes civil liberties in the name of some mysterious substance called freedom, and that war coarsens a culture while militarizing police and mines. If all of this is true, the offense of war that those infected by the madness call, quote, the defense industry, might just be the most cuckoo confabulation ever concocted. This much I have said a billion times, and 1,000,000,005 times I've replied to the World War II delusion that you will all very likely ask about as soon as I shut my mouth. No, World War II did not have anything to do with saving anyone from any death camp. The US and allied governments explicitly refused to accept the Jews out of Germany, and for openly anti-Semitic reasons. No steps were ever taken to halt the murders of the camps. The war killed several times what the camps did. The war came about after years of Western arms race with Japan and support for Nazi Germany. US corporations critically supported the Nazis right through the war for profit reasons and ideological ones. The Nordic race nonsense and the segregation laws and much of the extermination inspiration and technology came from the United States. The nuclear bombs were not needed for anything, and if it were needed for and nothing about World War II proves that violence is needed for anything. And if it were needed for opposing Nazism, hiring lots of top Nazis into the US military wouldn't have made much sense. Now I want to say something even crazier. Or if I'm right, I want to say quite sanely that something is even crazier than war. I have in mind the advancement of the risk of World War III, of the first war waged directly between big rich countries since World War II. A war likely to involve nuclear apocalypse. I don't think most of the people moving the world toward World War III think of themselves as doing that, but I don't think even the CEO of ExxonMobil thinks of himself as advancing the cause of climate collapse either. If the US president wanted to start World War III and be aware of doing so, he would simply launch the nukes. But here's what I really want us to think about. If a society wanted to start World War III without being aware of doing so, what would it do? I know Freud took a lot of flack for saying people had some mysterious death wish, even though they would deny it. But I think at this point, the burden of proof is on those who would try to prove him wrong. Because I don't think an effort to accidentally start World War III and blame it on somebody or something else would look particularly different from what US society is doing right now. The US military has plans for war on China and talks about a war on China as being perhaps a few years off. They call it a war with China, of course, and can count on Congress members to saturate us with the idea that China has aggressively threatened US prestige by growing wealthier, or aggressively moved into the waters just off the coast of China. But the fact is that despite major increases in its military spending, as the US has moved bases, troops, missiles, and ships, including what the US Navy ridiculously calls the Big Stick Carrier Strike Group near China, China still spends about 14% of what the US and its allies and weapons customers spend on militarism each year. Russia is at about 8% of just US military spending and falling. If there were a credible enemy for the US military on this planet, you would be hearing a lot less about UFOs right now. We also hear about Chinese violations of human rights, but bombs don't actually improve human rights. And if human rights violations justified bombs, then the US would have to bomb itself and most of its dearest allies as well as China. And how do you threaten war against someone for how they manufacture products that you buy? So maybe making sense isn't the goal. Maybe war is the goal. If you wanted to bring World War III closer, what would you have to do? One step would be to make war normal and unquestionable. Go ahead and check that one off. Done. Accomplished. Flags and pledges to them are ubiquitous. Thank yous for a supposed service are everywhere. Military advertisements and paid for pre-game ceremonies are so omnipresent that if the military forgets to pay for one, people will create one for free. The ACLU is arguing that young women should be added to young men in being forced to register for a draft, to be compelled against their will to go to war as a matter of civil liberties, the civil liberty to be completely stripped of all liberty. When President Joe Biden went off to meet with President Vladimir Putin, both major political parties in the United States generally encouraged hostility. The Hill newspaper sent out an email with a video of the movie Rocky, demanding that Biden be Rocky in the ring with Putin. When, despite everything, Biden and Putin behaved almost civilly and issued a tiny little statement suggesting they might possibly pursue some unspecified disarmament, and Biden stopped calling Putin a soulless killer, the two presidents then held a pair of separate press conferences. There were no Russian media questions allowed at Biden's, but US media brought the craziness to both. They hurled nutty accusations. They demanded red lines. They wanted a commitment to war as a response to so-called cyber war. They wanted declarations of distrust and enmity. They wanted self-righteous revenge for the supposed stealing of the 2016 election and enslavement of President Donald Trump. They would have appeared, I am convinced, to a disinterested observer from one of the UFOs they're always going on about, to have wanted World War III. The US military and NATO have indeed said that war can be a response to cyber war. At Putin's press conference, he discussed various actual laws existing and potential. Russia and China and other nations have long sought treaties to ban weaponizing space and to ban cyber war. At Biden's press conference, I don't think a single law was mentioned once by anyone. Yet the constant theme was imposing a rule-based order on others in the name of stability. Nothing boosts instability more than replacing the very idea of written laws with arbitrary decrees from might makes right officials who believe in their own goodness. Believe it so much that they announce, as Biden did, that were the US government to interfere in anyone else's elections and were the world to find out about it, the whole international order would crumble. We know of 85 foreign elections the United States has blatantly interfered in during the past 75 years, not to mention assassination attempts on over 50 foreign leaders. And we know that in poll after poll, the world says it fears the US government above all others as a threat to peace and democracy. Yet the international order does not collapse because it does not exist, not as a set of moral standards based on respect. If you wanted to move the world closer to World War III without realizing you were doing it, you could convince yourself that you were simply imposing a Pax Americana for the world's own good, whether the world liked it or not. Even while knowing in some back corner of your mind that sooner or later, the world would not stand for it. And that when that moment came, some Americans would die. And that when those Americans died, the US media and public would scream for blood and vengeance, as if the past many millennia had taught them nothing. And boom, you'd have what you never even knew you wanted, just like you have the day after browsing Amazon.com. But how to make sure to get those Americans killed? Well, nobody else has ever done this, but one idea would be to station them, and here's a real stroke of genius, with their families along, on bases all over the world. The bases would prop up and control some horrible governments in raging local populations. The bases would cause environmental damage as well as plagues of drunkenness, rape, and lawless privilege. They'd be sort of giant gated apartheid communities that the locals could enter to work menial jobs if they got out by sundown. Maybe 800 of these bases in 80 nations or so ought to do the trick. They would, strictly speaking, not be justifiable in terms of unavoidable future wars, given what can be moved where, how quickly now by airplane. But they might just make future wars unavoidable. So check that off the list, done, and almost unnoticed. Okay, what else? Well, you can't very well have a war against enemies without weapons, can you? The United States is now the leading weapons supplier to the world, to the rich countries, to the poor countries, to the so-called democracies, to the dictatorships, to the oppressive royal despots, and to most of its own designated enemies. The US government allows weapons sales and or gives free money with which to buy weapons and or provides training for 48 out of 50 of the most oppressive governments in the world, according to a ranking funded by the US government, plus plenty of nasty governments left out of that ranking. So when you hear that the guys who chopped up a Washington Post reporter for Saudi Arabia were trained in the United States, this is not an exception to the rule. This is the rule. Few, if any, wars happen without US weapons. Most wars today happen in places that manufacture few, if any, weapons. Few, if any, wars happen in the handful of countries that manufacture most of the weapons. You may think China is coming to get you. Your Congress member almost certainly thinks China is keenly focused on eliminating his or her right to send free mail and appear on television at will. But the US government funds and arms China and invests in a bioweapons lab in China, whatever may or may not have come out of it. The weapons dealers do not imagine, of course, that they are bringing on World War III. They're just doing business. And it's been gospel in Western madness for centuries that business causes peace. Those who work for weapons dealers mostly don't think they're causing war or peace. They just think they're serving the US flag and the so-called service members. They do this by pretending that most of the weapons companies' customers do not exist, that their only customer is the US military. All right, so the weapons bit is well covered. What else is needed? Well, if you wanted to roll a society into World War III over a period of years or decades, you'd need to avoid the vicissitudes of elections or popular mood swings. You'd want to increase corruption to the point that shifting power from one big political party to another didn't change anything terribly important. People could have a bit of emergency funding or a new holiday. The rhetoric could vary dramatically. But let's say you gave the White House and the Congress to the Democrats in 2020, for example. What would have to happen for the death train to remain on the tracks? Well, you'd want no actual wars to end. Nothing makes wars more likely than other wars. With both houses having voted repeatedly in the previous Congress to end the war on Yemen, vetoed by Trump, you'd need those votes to cease immediately. You'd want Biden to pretend to sort of partially end the war on Yemen and Congress to go mute. Same with Afghanistan. Keep the forces there and on surrounding bases quietly and make sure Congress does nothing in the way of actually forbidding the continuation of the war. In fact, it would be ideal to block Congress from ever lifting its grubby little paws again, as it pretended to do on Yemen when it could count on Trump vetoes. Perhaps it could be permitted to repeal the AUMF, or Authorization for the Use of Military Force, from 2002, but keep the 2001 one around just in case it was ever needed. Or perhaps that one could be replaced with a new one. Or the Senator Tim Kaine scam could be allowed to advance a bit, perhaps. This is where Congress itself repeals the War Powers Resolution that specifies how it can prevent wars and replaces it with a requirement that presidents consult with Congress before feeling free to ignore Congress. The trick is to market this abandonment of the War Powers Resolution as a strengthening of the War Powers Resolution. Okay, that should work. What else? Well, boost military spending beyond Trump levels. That's key. And invite the so-called progressive members of the United States Congress to lots of meetings. Maybe even give them a few rides on presidential airplanes. Threaten a few of them with primaries if needed. Whatever's needed to keep them from actually trying to block military spending. 5 of them in the House could block anything the Republicans oppose. But 100 of them putting out a public letter pretending to oppose what they facilitate will do no harm at all. Okay, that's easy. What else? Well, avoid peace with Iran. What good would that do? Just stall and prevaricate until we're past the Iranian elections and they've got a new super hostile government, and then blame the Iranians for that. It's never failed before. Why would it fail now? And keep funding and arming the attacks of Israel on Palestine. Keep Russiagate going, or at least don't renounce it, even if the journalists start appearing rather than just being crazy. A small price to pay. And nobody likes the media anyway, no matter how much they obey it. What else? Well, a major tool that has increasingly proven its worth is sanctions. The US government is brutally sanctioning numerous populations around the globe, fueling suffering, animosity, and bellicosity, and almost nobody knows it. Or they think of it as law enforcement rather than law violation. It's brilliant. The US government can even impose sanctions, cause suffering, blame the suffering on the local government's efforts to alleviate the suffering, and propose a coup as a solution straight from the rule-based order. We rule, so we give the orders. Also, we'd better be sure to keep the climate catastrophe on track, and for a number of reasons. First, if the nuclear apocalypse never comes, the climate one will. Second, the climate disasters can be used to fuel international crises that, with enough prodding and arming, can lead to wars. Third, the military can actually be marketed as a climate protector because, although it's a major contributor to climate change, it can announce how concerned it is and use natural disasters to excuse invasions and establish new bases. And nothing builds up war spirit better than refugees, no matter who caused the horrors that they are fleeing. Okay, isn't this enough? What else could be needed? Well, you can't very well put World War III straight onto the stage unrehearsed, can you? We'll want to have some full dress rehearsals, major ones, the sort that could accidentally morph into the real thing, the biggest ones ever in Europe and in the Pacific. And more missiles in places near Russia and China, and more nations invited into NATO, especially some of those right on the border of Russia that Russia says it would never sit still for. War in Ukraine may be a bit too obvious. How about a coup in Belarus, perhaps? What you want is to risk World War III without jumping straight in with both feet. After all, the other guys need to start it. Let's think, how did the US get into World War II? Well, there was the Atlantic Charter. Let's make a new one. Check. There was sanctioning and threatening Japan. Make that China. Check. There was supporting Nazis in Germany. Okay, make that Ukraine. Check. There were big new bases and ships and planes and troops in the Pacific. Check. History doesn't repeat exactly, but there are many opportunities. Drone murders and bases and so-called anti-terror operations across Africa and Asia, coups and destabilizations in Latin America, plenty of hotspots, plenty of weapons, plenty of propaganda, cyber wars anywhere at any time, and who can say who started them for sure? War is getting easier and easier. So let's ask a different question. What would US society look like if it wanted to avoid World War III? Well, it would drop the exceptionalist shtick and join the world. Stop being the biggest holdout on human rights treaties. Stop being the biggest vetoer at the UN. Stop being the biggest opponent of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Start supporting the rule of law instead of the rule-based order. Start supporting democracy at the United Nations instead of as a word you say in speeches. And prioritize cooperating in global efforts to address environmental and health issues.